I've made loads of videos now looking at really common chord progressions that get used time and time again in loads of popular songs. But today I want to look at some slightly less common chord progressions. Not necessarily complex chord progressions. The 4 chord progressions we're going to look at today are actually all still diatonic. They're all within the key. They're not sort of fancy, jazzy chord progressions. But for one reason or another, they're less common than some of the other loops and chord progressions that we've looked at so far. So let's begin with this chord progression, which I call the She Loves You chord progression, because it was used in the verse of She Loves You by the Beatles. It's the chords 1, 6, 3, 5, which in the key of C major would be C, A minor, E minor and G major. So this chord progression, as I mentioned at the beginning, is diatonic. It's perfectly within the major scale, nothing fancy going on. But this combination of chords just happens to be less common. And I think one of the things that makes it quite characterful and noticeable is the use of this 3 chord. The 3rd chord of the key, for whatever reason, is less commonly used in chord progressions. Out of the 6 main chords of the major key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, the 3rd chord just happens to turn up less often. But that means that when we do use it, it can give our chord progression an interesting and more noticeable character.
Can do the thing you do. Everywhere you go, you shout it. You don't have to be shy about it now.
You love me in our frozen time.
Valentine told me who's to go.
You call for me, no horror. I know what I know. I know that girl you found. Hold on to love. That is what I do. Now that I follow him.
The next chord progression I want to talk about is the chord progression 1, 2, 6, 4. In the key of C, that would be C, D minor, A minor, and F. And this is the chord progression used in the song Starlight by Muse. For the verse and the chorus, most of the song is based on a loop of this chord progression. Nothing particularly fancy going on here. It's almost identical to the Axis of Awesome chord progression, the classic 1, 5, 6, 4, but the 5 here has been swapped out for a 2 chord. So the first 2 chord progressions we looked at in this video were in the major key. The second 2 we're going to look at are in the minor key. And this next one's what I would call the Jolene chord progression. The chord progression of 1, 3, 7, 1 in the minor key, which is the chords A minor, C, G, A minor. And this chord progression has a clear sense of beginning and end, of cadence, because we start in our home, we go on a short journey where we go up and down the scale, and then we return to our home. So we have a clear beginning, middle and end.
Jolene, 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 Jolene.
So the final chord progression that we're going to look at in this video is very similar to the Jolene chord progression that we looked at a minute ago. It only differs by its last chord. So once again, it starts with the 1 chord in the minor key, the 3 chord in the minor key, the 7 chord in the minor key, but this time, rather than going back to where we started on 1, we go to the 6 chord in the minor key. And this is a chord progression that I would call the Polly chord progression because it was used in the song Polly by Nirvana. In the key of A minor, it would be A minor, C, G, and F.
Polly wants a cracker.
Now, something that you might have noticed with the final 2 chord progressions that we talked about in this video is the way that they were written out in Roman numerals. Because they were both in the minor key, there's actually more than one way to write a minor key chord progression out in Roman numerals. The way I did it is I act as if we're still in the major scale effectively. So although the chord progression was in A minor, when I got to the C major chord, I didn't just write 3 for the 3rd chord in the minor key, I wrote flat 3 because I'm relating it back to the A major scale in which we have a C sharp. So if I want to talk about C natural, I have to flatten the 3rd. Same with the G major chord, the 7th chord in the key. I wrote flat 7 because in the key of A major, we'd usually have a G sharp, so you have to flatten it to get to a G natural. Now, the other way of talking about a minor key chord progression using Roman numerals is to just relate it back to the minor key. Rather than talking about the flat 7 or the flat 3, we just say the 7 or the 3 in A minor. And then it sort of is just more elegant and natural because we don't have all of these flat sort of confusing things. And that does make sense if the fact that we're in the minor key is already abundantly clear. So when we're analysing a song, for example, it will often be stated that this song is in A minor. So at that point, we can talk about the chord progression in terms of simply just 1, 3, 7, and 1. But in the context of an actual song, whether we're in the major key or the minor key, or maybe even another tonality like Mixolydian or Dorian, those things aren't always abundantly clear. They're not always set in stone. So if we're actually using Roman numerals to analyse a song, maybe even to play a song off a chord chart, then we don't want to confuse things by constantly having to reiterate whether we're in A minor or A major or A Mixolydian. So instead what we do is we just say we're in the key of A. And then because the Roman numerals are assuming we're in the A major scale, we don't need to know what the tonality is. We don't have to set that in stone. We can just still play the entire song, understand the entire song, using the same set of Roman numerals. If we had a song, for example, that moved from A major to A minor at one point, which isn't uncommon, it would get confusing if we had a 3 symbol, whether that was referring to C sharp major or C natural major. So that's why even if it looks less elegant and less simple, it can make more sense in the long run to describe all chord progressions, regardless of their tonality, with reference to the major scale. And then there's no ambiguity to what chord we're asking the player to perform.